Today we continue in our series, Faith and Science. As I began last week with our first part, I introduced it by saying, in order to actually completely grasp both, or the complicated relationship between faith and science, you need to have doctorate degrees in all of the ologies, geology, biology, cosmology, whatever, theology. You need to have all of these degrees in order to really understand. Since none of us have all of those degrees, we're just simply doing the best we can as we dig in to this complex relationship between faith and science. Today we're asking the question, can they coexist? Now, frequently when we ask such a question, or when a question like this gets addressed through a sermon or through a speech or a presentation, usually what's being talked about is creation, creation versus evolution, but we're not going to be actually digging into that topic. We addressed it a little bit last week. We'll look at a different angle next week, but today we're looking at that topic in general. In general, what is the relationship between faith and science? And can these two things coexist? A few years ago, this dress became very popular on social media. It went viral, as they say, because people were posting pictures, what is it, what color is this dress? And it broke into two main camps. There was one group that saw this dress as white and gold. They said, that's what it is. It's white and gold. I don't see how anyone else can see anything other than white and gold when they look at this picture of this dress. There was another group, though, that saw this picture of this dress and said, no, it's not white and gold. It's actually black and blue. And I don't know what you are talking about saying that it's white and gold. It's obviously black and blue. You guys are crazy. It's not. We're true. We see what it sees. We see what it looks like, and it's black and it's blue. There's only one dress, and yet that one dress was seen two different ways. This one dress caused two different groups to arise. This one dress split people into two different beliefs. And that happens, I think, frequently in life. And perhaps of all the pictures that you might see through the sermon, this might be the most important. Because there are things that we encounter in life that we see from one perspective. And we see the shadow that it casts on the wall, and we know that, I am certain beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is a circle. And someone else comes along, and from their perspective, from their experience, they see the shadow on the wall, and they say, I am convinced, I know for sure, with certainty, that that's a square. Both things are true from the various perspectives, from various experiences, and yet at the same time, it's a cylinder. At the same time, these things that are true, people are so concerned with these things that are true that they're missing out on the truth that is right in front of them, that is right in front of us. I believe this holds true for life. See, all of us have common experiences in life. We don't all live the same life, obviously, but we all have shared experiences, common experiences. We've all seen a beautiful sunset or a sunrise. We've all had a tasty, delicious meal. We've all had the pleasure and the privilege of petting a dog or a cat, or in Kim's case, a lizard. We've all had these experiences that are common, and we live these lives that are filled with joy and pain, with pleasure and suffering. And yet, while we have this one life and we have these common experiences, people view things differently. People view this life from different perspectives. And by and large, we've kind of separated into two groups. One group that sees faith on the wall, one group that sees science on the wall. And while these things might be true, perhaps the thing that's truth is getting overlooked. Here's a video to help.
Science is about trying to get rigorous answers to questions about how nature works. And it's a very important process that's actually quite reliable if carried out correctly with generation of hypotheses and testing of those by accumulation of data, and then drawing conclusions that are continually revisited to be sure they're right. So if you want to answer questions about how nature works, how biology works, for instance, science is the way to get there. Scientists believe in that, and they are very troubled by a suggestion that other kinds of approaches can be taken to derive truth about nature. And some, I think, have seen faith as therefore a threat to the scientific method and therefore to be resisted. But faith in its proper perspective is really asking a different set of questions, and that's why I don't think there needs to be a conflict here. The kinds of questions that faith can help one address are more in the philosophical realm. Why are we all here? Why is there something instead of nothing? Is there a God? Isn't it clear that those aren't scientific questions and that science doesn't have much to say about them? But you either have to say, well, those are inappropriate questions and we can't discuss them, or you have to say we need something besides science to pursue some of the things that humans are curious about. For me, that makes perfect sense. But I think for many scientists, particularly for those who have seen the shrill pronouncements from extreme views that threaten what they're doing scientifically and feel, therefore, that they can't really include those thoughts into their own worldview, faith can be seen as an enemy. And similarly, on the other side, some of my scientific colleagues who are of an atheist persuasion are sometimes using science as a club over the head of believers, basically suggesting that anything that can't be reduced to a scientific question isn't important, and it just represents superstition and it should be gotten rid of. Part of the problem is, I think the extremists have occupied the stage. Those voices are the ones we hear. I think most people are actually kind of comfortable with the idea that science is a reliable way to learn about nature, but it's not the whole story. And there's a place also for religion, for faith, for theology, for philosophy. But that harmony perspective doesn't get as much attention. Nobody's as interested in harmony as they are in conflict, I'm afraid.
So Francis Collins, if you're not aware, he is one of the world's leading scientists. He was one of the leaders, I think the lead scientist in the Human Genome Project that dug into the science of DNA and really explored and found unlocked a lot of the questions that we had about human life through this genome project. And more importantly, or maybe more interestingly, he was an ardent atheist, but through his study and through his work, he has become a believer in Jesus Christ. But he frames this question of science and faith quite well. From his perspective as a Christian and as a scientist, he explained through this short video the difficulty in the relationship between science and faith. And towards the end, he talked about the extremism. He said, there are people in this world that all they focus on is faith. They're just concerned with faith. They see that shadow on the wall as faith, and they focus so completely on faith to the exclusion or the detriment of science. On the other hand, he said there's the other extremes, the other extremist group that sees nothing but science. That's all they focus on. That's all they care about, to the exclusion and to the detriment of faith. He also mentions that another concept, he briefly touches on the concept that perhaps faith and science are both important, but they address different things. They don't overlap. That faith is good for its realm here, and science is good in its realm over here, but there is no connection between the two. In fact, there is a more technical term for this belief, or this theory, which is called non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA for short. Non-overlapping magisteria was something proposed by Stephen Jay Gould. And if you were here last Sabbath, you'll remember we talked about him briefly. He was an American paleontologist and one of the leading atheist proponents that we had in our society. I think he passed away in the late 90s. And he proposed this concept, that science was the king of nature and faith was the king of philosophy. And there was no need to overlap, that they were the rulers of their separate domains and never the two should meet. But while this might have been a convincing explanation for some, many people have found problems with it. For example, Steve Weinberg, who's an American physicist, Nobel Prize winner, and one of our current leaders in atheist thought, he writes that one often hears that there is no conflict between science and religion. For instance, in a review of Johnson's book, Stephen Gould remarks that science and religion do not come into conflict because science treats factual reality while religion treats human morality. On most things, I tend to agree with Gould, Weinberg says, but here I think he goes too far. The meaning of religion is defined by what religious people actually believe, and the great majority of the world's religious people would be surprised to learn that religion has nothing to do with factual reality. And isn't this the case for most of us? I think for all of us. We're here at a church on a Saturday morning because we believe that our religious concepts, our religious beliefs, have an impact in factual reality. That's why we get up and come to church. That impacts our reality. That impacts what we do, how we live our lives. And there's a factual basis to our beliefs. And so Stephen Weinberg is saying, which most people understand, that there in fact is an overlap between faith and science. I know this might look like the MasterCard logo, but it's true. There is an overlap between faith and science that most all of us are aware of, that we're comfortable with. Even though we might have questions, we see that they just can't exist apart from each other. Here's a diagram, so to speak, of what I believe most people's experience is between this relationship between science and religion. Science and the theories and laws, observations and experiments, they form a framework, a basis for our understanding of the natural world, of the things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. But apart from that, we all have our ultimate beliefs. We all have a philosophy of life. And some of us, I believe all of us here, have a religious philosophy, some theological understandings that form our ultimate beliefs. But there is a gap between science, between what we observe, between the things, the data that we encounter in life. And there's a gap between that and our ultimate beliefs. And the only way that that gap is bridged is through intuition, reason, but mainly faith. There takes a step of faith in everyone to go from what they observe through science to what they hold as their ultimate beliefs, their ultimate philosophy, or their ultimate religious ideas. Now, what exactly does this mean? Can we give you an example? Yes, I can. Redshift. Doesn't that make sense for everyone? That answers your question? All right, redshift is part of the science. It's part of this foundational aspect of that previous graph. Now, what redshift is it's a concept in physics. In physics, redshift happens when light or other electromagnetic radiation from an object is increased in wavelength or shifted to the red end of the spectrum. In more common language, scientists, physicists, astronomers are able to measure the wavelengths of energy or of light or electromagnetic radiation. And when things are closer together, the wavelengths are shorter and they appear to be blue. When things are farther apart, the wavelengths are longer and they appear to be red. Is that understandable so far? And you can kind of see that in the picture there. So when the light source comes closer to you, the light shift or the electromagnetic radiation shift goes blue. When the light source goes farther from you, it goes red. I think we're all understanding that concept of redshift. So what does that have to do with anything else? Well, as I said, physicists and astronomers have observed that the electromagnetic radiation of the universe is shifted red, which means that the universe is expanding, right? The farther things will go away from you, the more it shifts red. The closer they are, it would be blue. So if the universe was contracting, it would be blue. But because the universe is expanding, scientists are able to observe that there is a redshift in space, in this universe, that there is a definite, verifiable expansion of the universe. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that impact our beliefs? How does that impact our beliefs? Well, what that really leads to is the Big Bang. I know some of us might not be comfortable with that terminology, but if you can keep in mind maybe that bumper sticker that some of you have seen, that God spoke and bang, it happened. So the Big Bang makes sense from a scientific perspective because if the universe is expanding, because the redshift shows that it's getting bigger, it means that at some point it was smaller, right? At some point it was closer together. And they figure through their scientific methods that at some point they're able to go back in time to the point where it wasn't expanding, in fact, all the way back until it didn't exist. Or more precisely, when it existed as a singularity, when the whole universe was just all the way back into a very small singularity. So that's what the redshift shows. That's what science has shown and explained, that as the universe expands, because it's expanding, it also had to be expanding from something, which means that it had to have a starting point. And thus the Big Bang, because that was the starting point. Now people see the Big Bang, they see that's where the science ends. The science has said that the universe is expanding because of the redshift. Science has said that means that the universe was contracted at one point, but that's where it ends. There's no further explanation. There's no more science to explain the why of that, the reason why that singularity exploded and had the Big Bang. There's no science to explain the how of why of how it exploded and caused the universe to come into being. The science stops there. That at some point in the past, the universe was contracted into a singularity. That's where science ends. And so people see that piece of information and they view it differently. That's where that leap of faith comes in. Because people see that end of science, and some people see that it was contracted down to a start. And as Stephen Hawking says, so long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose that it had a creator. They see that this Big Bang and the result of the Big Bang, or the implications of the Big Bang, says that there was a beginning to the universe, and thus, because it has a beginning, we can believe that there was a creator involved. Now, Stephen Hawking isn't necessarily a creationist, but he says, if we see that the universe had a beginning, we can suppose it has a creator. That's what some scientists see. They see the end of science They jump that gap in faith and see that science points to a creator. On the other hand, there are other scientists that see that science and come to the end of that science and are left with that singularity. And they say, like Quentin Smith, if this cosmology is true, our universe exists without cause and without explanation. There are numerous possible universes, and there is possibly no universe at all. And there is no reason why this one is actual rather than some other one, or none at all. Kind of confusing. I don't really follow all of that. But he comes to the same point of science, because that's as far as it goes, to that singularity of the universe. And he says, I don't see a creator there. I see that it doesn't make a difference one way or the other. I think it just devolves or evolves or transpires into a branching out of deeper philosophy. He says, because it could mean more universes, no universes, it could mean a whole bunch of other stuff, but I don't see a creator there at the start of the universe. The same piece of observable scientific data, two different views. Two different ultimate beliefs are supported by that different leaps of faith. This isn't necessarily a particular point, but in my research, I thought this was an interesting quote from Christopher Isham, an English theoretical physicist. He says that perhaps the best argument in favor of the thesis that the Big Bang supports theism is the obvious unease with which it is greeted by some atheist physicists. Because a lot of scientists see this Big Bang as evidence for a creator. I would say the majority of physicists see that the fact that the universe was condensed to a singularity and then exploded into something as evidence for an intelligent designer. And so that's what this theoretical physicist is saying. He said, there's so many people that believe, so many scientists that see the Big Bang as evidence for a God or a creator. And the best evidence is the fact that the atheists are very wary of getting involved in discussing the Big Bang because they understand the implications that has for science and for religion and for faith in general. And so we can see how that leap of faith happens for everyone. How science gets us to a point, but in order to reach our ultimate beliefs, whether or not they're religious or not, whatever our philosophical ultimate beliefs are, everyone needs to take a step of faith. See, the truth is, we need to bear in mind that faith and science are intertwined. That we can't continue living, or that we can't really justify this belief that science is over here and faith is over here, that neither informs the other. That in actuality, faith and science coexist because they are enmeshed, they are entangled, they are connected, and they can't be separated completely to their own distinct realms. As we can see, that faith is a component in the lives of even the most ardent atheist, the most person that's most focused on science. There is always going to be that step of faith that is necessary. Now, I understand that a lot of atheists would have a problem with me saying that there's faith involved in their life, and they might not use the word faith. They might use presuppositions or other understandings or some other type of word or concept. But there is that gap that everyone experiences between where science ends and where ultimate beliefs begin. And so we need to bear in mind that faith and science are intertwined. And scientists understand this. Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant scientists who has ever lived, he wasn't even a religious person, a particularly religious person himself. I believe the saying goes that he felt a general cosmic religious feeling as he studied and as he learned and as he experienced life. But he understood that there was this connection between faith and science. And he says that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. He said there is an overlap, and there is a necessary overlap, because you can't really live without one, without the other. In fact, Charles Darwin, the father of the evolutionary theory, he understands that there is an overlap, a relationship between faith and science. He says that it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. It might be a little confusing with some of the double negatives there, but what he's saying is he believes that it's understandable to be both an ardent theist, an ardent believer in God, and an evolutionist. Now, we might disagree with that, particularly, but still, that concept was in Darwin's mind, of all people, that there was an overlap between faith and science, that you didn't have to have one at the exclusion of the other. Now, we've talked about how faith is involved in a scientific experience. But how is science involved in a faith experience? Well, let's look at the scientific theory of relativity. We all have heard that, I'm sure, in school, the famous theorem that Einstein came up with, that E equals mc squared. Does anyone know what those letters stand for? Energy is the E. What's the M is the mass. And I heard the C somewhere. I heard speed of light, yes. So energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Don't you feel smarter already? But that's, we might not exactly know how to apply it particularly, but that's the formula for the theory of relativity. In 1971, they conducted an experiment called the Haffel-Keating experiment that had to do with this theory of relativity. Now, what the scientists did is they found some cesium atomic clocks, cesium beam atomic clocks. Now, these are very, very, very precise clocks. And even for 1971, they might have come up with some more exact clocks since then, but at the time, those were the most precise clocks you could get. And they synced these clocks up down to the nanosecond. They left some of the clocks on Earth, and they put some of the clocks onto commercial airliners. And those airplanes proceeded to fly around the world a couple times. And when they landed, they got the clocks that they had synced on Earth, and they compared them with the clocks that were on the airplanes. And what did they find? They found that they were off by nanoseconds, which was predicted precisely by the theory of relativity. Now, which ones do you think, which clock ended up being slower? The one on the plane. The one on the plane ended up being slower because the theory of relativity says the faster you go, the speed of light squared, and I don't know exactly how it's applied, but the faster you go, the slower time gets. So the planes that were flying and traveling at hundreds of miles an hour, their clocks slowed down compared to the ones that were still on Earth. Which means that the theory of relativity is ultimately stating that light becomes outside of time. The faster you go, the slower time goes, until you reach the speed of light. Obviously, those planes never reached the speed of light, but they were going fast enough to slow down their times compared to the clocks that were on the ground. So the faster you go, the slower time goes until you hit that speed of light. And when you hit that speed of light, time no longer progresses. So when you travel at the speed of light, time becomes irrelevant. That is why light is outside of time. Okay, so what does that have to do with anything, really? Like, I came to church, Pastor. I didn't come to some physics lecture. How does that... Yeah, if we all traveled at the speed of light, we would not age, right? So we just got to start running faster, okay? But how does this scientific theory impact faith? In the Bible, Revelation 1:18, God says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. Here God says he is out of time. Here God says he knows the beginning from the end. Here God says time does not apply to me. And for many of us, maybe most of us, we read these things and we think, oh yeah, that applies to God. I don't understand it, I don't grasp it, but that's what God says, so I believe it. And yet the theory of relativity says, you know what? Light is outside of time, and we can understand that in a general sense. So because we can understand that light is outside of time, we can understand God's relationship to time. Because if light can be outside of time, God can be outside of time. Something as complex as the theory of relativity can give us insight into something that many of us might dismiss as a mystical aspect of God. Another example, quantum entanglement. This might not be quite as popular, as understood as E equals mc squared, but what quantum entanglement says that there are two particles, and they can interact dependently on each other, even when they are separated by great distances. So, example, if two particles were connected, you can understand that you pushed one to the left, it would impact the other one, right? That makes sense. But if you pull them apart and you push one way, you would expect the other one not to be impacted at all because they're separate. But the quantum entanglement theory is saying no, because they're entangled on a quantum level that you push one, the other one is going to react, even though they're separated. They did an experiment, and in an article in the journal Nature in 2012, they reported on this experiment. They said that two particles were separated by 88 miles, 143 kilometers, and they were still connected and interacted with each other instantaneously. That particles 88 miles apart, you impacted one, and the other one would respond instantaneously. Now this is maybe to a better or more popular understanding of this. If you've ever watched Star Trek movie or the TV show, the Beam Me Up Scotty, that teleporter, this is the kind of the principle that undergirds that concept, that you can impact particles in one place and it would instantaneously impact particles in another place. So that's kind of help us understand that generally, this quantum entanglement theory. You're like, okay, so Pastor, apart from maybe understanding Star Trek a little bit better, how does this impact my faith? Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verses 6 to 7, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Jesus is saying that God knows each one of us so intimately that he knows the numbers of hairs on our head. Now, how in the world can God know the number of hairs on your head and my head and on, someone's head in Mexico, someone's head in China? How can, in a more practical sense, how can God hear my prayer and your prayer and a Russian's prayer and someone in Belize's prayer? How can he hear all of these? More practical than that, how can God help me with my financial need while he's helping you with your health need, while he's helping someone else understand their spiritual need as they read the Bible? How can God do all of this while we're spread out all across the globe? And how can he do it at the same time? Quantum entanglement says particles can be interacting with each other spread over great distances. And if a particle can interact with another particle, even though they're miles and miles and miles apart, God can interact with us, even though we're spread miles and miles and miles apart. It gives us an understanding of God's relationship to distance, something that we might see and read about in Scripture and think, oh, that's just I don't know, magical, I don't understand it, I don't comprehend it, but God says it, so I'm just going to believe it on blind faith. God says, no, look to nature, because nature is going to tell you that you don't need to have blind faith, that nature is going to get you to understand with a more reasonable grasp of who I am and what my abilities are, what my capabilities are. If particles can simultaneously interact in an instant over large distances, God can interact simultaneously in an instant with humans across the earth. This is how science impacts faith. We always need to bear in mind that faith and science are intertwined. That there is a relationship, a necessary relationship between the two, because both of them provide the bigger picture for us as we examine life, and more importantly, as we learn about God. We need both faith and science to grasp the bigger picture.
Why is the water boiling? Okay, no doubt. You're going to say that the heat from the hot plate is being transferred into the liquid water. As the temperature increases, the kinetic energy increases, exciting the liquids in the liquid molecules in that liquid state to go out to the vapor state. The vapor pressure increases until it reaches atmospheric pressure, at which point nucleation points within the glass allow bubbles to form, overcoming the enthalpy of vaporization, and thus it boils. Duh. But actually, what I tell you is no, that's not really why the water's boiling. The water's boiling because I want some tea. Love tea. Tea's really good. Which answer is the correct one? You see, we actually need both the science explanation and the deeper meaning explanation to get the fuller picture of reality. Each answer is incomplete without the other, and really insufficient without the other. And it causes us to have a smaller understanding of what the reality is.
Having an answer to both questions makes us understand the bigger picture better. Science and faith are meant to work in harmony. They're meant to work together to paint the bigger picture of life. More importantly, they're meant to work together to paint the bigger picture of who God is. See, God is that cylinder. God is truth. And He casts a shadow of science, and He casts a shadow of faith. And we need both to understand the reality that God is truth. Sir Francis Bacon, English philosopher, statesman, scientist, jurist, orator, and author. In fact, Francis Bacon is the last person on earth that it was said that he truly knew everything. He knew, at that point, he knew everything there was to know on earth. But past him, more knowledge has been increased, or science, and so he was the last person to really be a know-it-all. He says, "Let no man or woman, out of conceit or laziness, think or believe that anyone can search too far or be too well informed in the book of God's works or the book of God's words. Instead, let everyone endless improve their understanding of both." He said, you can't just study one book and not the other. You can't just study the Bible and at the expense of the book of nature. You can't just study the book of nature at the expense of the Bible. Both are important. Both need to be studied because both paint the picture of who God really is. Both reveal the truth of who God is. Isaac Newton, the famous mathematician, astronomer, and physicist, he writes that the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. He says, I've studied the book of nature. I've studied the book of God's works. He said, and because I study that, I see God better. I understand God better. Nature points to God. It helps me to see the bigger picture. A little closer to home, Ellen White, one of the founders of the Adventist Church, she writes, next to the Bible, nature is to be our great lesson book. The whole natural world is designed to be an interpreter of the things of God. That we don't just learn about God through the Bible. We learn about God through nature. The creation reveals the Creator. And we need both because both are connected. Both overlap. Both have the same purpose of pointing us to God and revealing Him to us. We always need to bear in mind that faith and science are intertwined. As Psalm 111 verse 2 says, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. God's works are great. God's works are great as the Bible says. And the Bible says, study His works. Not just be content studying this book. Don't just be content reading the Psalms, but go out in nature and study the works of God in nature and creation, because it is a delightful thing to do, to learn about these scientific principles, because they don't point away from God, they point to God. They help paint the bigger picture of life and of God. So the question, can faith and science coexist? The answer is yes. Not only can they coexist, they have to coexist. They need to coexist because both are important parts. Both are important ways of understanding God, of seeing God, and we need them both to see the true big picture of who God is, of His love for us, of His creation for us, and ultimately of His promise of our salvation.